A lot of people ask me, what's the best advice to someone who wants to be a director? And the answer I give is very simple. Be a director. Pick up a camera, shoot something, no matter how small, no matter how cheesy, no matter whether your friends and your sister star in it, put your name on it as director. Now you're a director. Everything after that, you're just negotiating your budget and your fee. So it's a state of mind is really the point. Once you commit yourself to do it, then the hard part starts, which is that you have to forswear all other paths, because you can't keep a foot in cabinet making and a foot in directing. You can't keep a foot in one job, and it's a total and all-consuming thing. And I suspect that many of the difficult and challenging things in the world, whether it's research or whatever, but certainly in the arts, must be all-consuming, because you're in competition with people who have made that decision, who have committed themselves 100%. You're competing for resources. It's a big coral reef, and it's a big food chain, and you're competing for resources. And you're competing against people who have made that commitment. If you don't make the same commitment, you're not going to compete. It's that simple. You never really get an opportunity. You take an opportunity. In the filmmaking business, no one ever gives you anything. Nobody ever taps you on the shoulder and say, I've really admired the way you talk and the way you draw. I think you'd make a good director. It doesn't happen that way. You have to constantly be pulling on somebody's sleeve, saying, hey, I want to direct, I want to direct, I want to direct, and you have to be willing to make sacrifices to do that. The mistake a lot of people, I think, make in Hollywood is that they think, well, I'll get to the top of my field as a whatever, editor, production designer, writer, and then I'll just move laterally into directing, and I'll be more respected, and I'll have more power. It doesn't work that way, because you drop right to the bottom of the pack as a director. You have to work your way up in that. I'm not saying it's not done, but so the way I did it was I came in through production design, which is good because you're thinking visually, and you're very aware of the director's problems in trying to tell a story, and how the environment is a manifestation of the narrative in some way. And I sort of proved myself as a production designer in the scrappy, stay up all night for 15 days in a row kind of independent filmmaking that was done at Roger Corman's place. This was in the early '80s. And when they see that you have the creativity and the stamina, and that you basically understand filmmaking, it's not a ridiculous leap in that environment to say, I now want to try my hand. I want to direct. And I just basically went up to Roger one day and said, I'd like to direct second unit on the film that we were making at the time, which was a low-budget science fiction horror picture. And he gave me a camera and two or three people, and we started a little second unit, and the second unit basically became this steamroller that wound up shooting about a third of the picture, because they were falling way behind on first unit. So they'd give me the actors and say, well, do scene 28 and scene 42, and all of a sudden I was working with actors, and that was terrifying, because I hadn't really thought that part through yet, that in order to direct you have to work with actors. It's not just about sets and visual effects. And so it was simultaneously a shock and a joyful discovery, because I found that all actors really want is some sense of what a writer can bring to the moment, some sense of a narrative purpose. What am I doing? What am I trying to do here? What's the scene about? And it's really pretty much that simple. So that was the next epiphany, if you will, which is this part of it is fun too. The part I didn't expect to be fun, the part I didn't expect to be good at, turned out to be, in a way, the most fascinating part. I wouldn't say I was good at it right away. It took me a long time to realize that you have to have a bit of an interlanguage with actors. You have to give them something that they can act with. You can't tell them a lot of abstract information about how their character is going to pay off in this big narrative ellipse that happens in scene 80. That doesn't help them. They're in a room. They have to create an emotional truth in a moment, and they have to be able to create that very quickly. So they need real tangible stuff, and that's a learned art, I think. But coming from from writing and understanding what they're feeling and what they're thinking, what the character's feeling and thinking, and having thought about that a lot for months in advance is the way that I get enough respect from the actors that they trust what I'm saying, they trust what I'm giving them to do. I was hired to direct a film called Piranha 2. I was hired by a very unscrupulous producer who worked out of Italy, and he put me with an Italian crew who spoke no English, even though I was assured that they would all speak English. And I actually had to learn some Italian very quickly, and I'm talking about in 2 weeks, because that's all the prep time I had, because I was actually replacing someone else. And I was put into an untenable situation, and then fired couple of weeks into the shoot, and the producer took over directing. And it turns out that he had actually done that twice before on his 2 previous films, and that was his modus operandi in order to get the financing and then axe the director. And in the course of throwing me off the movie, he never showed me a foot of the film that I had shot. He held on to the dailies. He wouldn't. We were shooting in Jamaica, and I would shoot in Jamaica. The dailies would go to New York, be processed. He'd fly to New York and look at them and not send them back for me to see. So I wasn't even seeing my own film. So he basically came in and said, "Your stuff doesn't work, doesn't cut together. It's a pile of junk, and you're off the movie." And then he took over the film. And I thought, I really don't. I mean, okay, maybe I'm just bad. Maybe I'm just not good. So I went to, a couple of months later, I went to Rome to find out sort of the truth, like what really happened. And he wouldn't show me any of the film. And I had been in Rome prepping the film for a couple of weeks before we went, and I remembered the code to get in, and so I went in and I just ran the film for myself. And it wasn't that bad. Because all I wanted to know was just one simple fact: could I or could I not do this job? And I made a few changes, before I flew back, which I don't know if they ever caught. I don't know if the editor ever noticed that I actually fixed a couple things. But I had to know whether what they had said was true. So here's a case where everyone around me had basically said, "You stink, you suck, you don't know what you're doing," and I accepted it. But then a little voice kept saying, "I don't think so. I don't think it could be that bad. I remember doing some pretty cool stuff with the actors in this moment and that moment." And I looked at it, and it was fine. So then I thought, you know what, I actually can do this, and I just fell in with a pack of thieves and wackos here. But I also realized that I was going to have to get busy and create my own thing, that nobody would hire me after that experience. Nobody would hire me and just put me on a film. I'd have to create my own thing and hang on tenaciously to that in order to be able to direct again. And that's why I wrote The Terminator, and I had many, many people trying to buy that script, but I wouldn't sell them. I wouldn't sell the script to them unless I went with it as the director. And of course, that was a turnoff for almost everybody. But we did find one low-budget producer who was willing to make the film, and that was John Daly at Hemdale, and that's how I got my real start. The road to success is like Harold and the Purple Crayon. You draw it for yourself. You have to imagine it first, and then you have to draw it, and then you have to walk it. But I think many people draw many lines that don't necessarily lead there, but the ones that do lead there are done by that process. Not for everybody. Some people can fall into good luck. Some people can have it handed to them, but I think the great majority map it out for themselves. But you always have self-doubts, and when you're working in a public art form like filmmaking, you don't really need self-doubt, because if it's bad, you're going to hear about it, exactly what's wrong with it, and if it's good, you'll hear what's good about it. So there are plenty of other people who will inform you. So self-doubt is not really necessary. You can sort of just set that one aside, just drop it at the door. What you need is a lot of confidence to stand up to the slings and arrows, the barrage of negativity. Because what basically it boils down to is that we exist in a peer environment, and when we're sort of on the fringe or on the outside and we're trying to get in, all our peers are like us, and just a bunch of friends or people with similar interests, and none of them think you're special. They think they're special. So no one's going to give you encouragement, or very few people will give you encouragement. It's like that old adage, it's not enough to succeed, your friends must also fail. you know. So you're not going to get a lot of tremendous encouragement from your peer group, and you can't feed on that energy. You can actually support each other in very tangible ways, but I think that thing of, dude, you got it, you're going all the way, you're not going to hear that. And you're certainly going to face rejection after rejection. You're going to knock on a lot of doors, and you're going to have to prove yourself. But I think, I think you kind of know that going in. If you're going into the filmmaking process, I think you have to go in with your eyes open, that's what it's going to be like. And here's an interesting thing, that there's a tremendous temptation to do a workaround, or to do a moral or ethical workaround or shortcut in a lot of situations, because it's easier, and it's just, you're so needy to get those little breaks and so on. And I think a lot of people get sort of ethically short-circuited at that stage, and they never recover. Because I think a lot of people would say, well, I'll do what I have to do now, but then later I'll be good. It doesn't work that way. You are who you are. And fortunately I've managed to get where I am with the occasional burglary aside, without having to really hurt anybody or go against my word. I think ultimately your word becomes the most important thing that you have. It's the most important currency that you have. Having a successful film is very important currency as well, but in the long run, your word is the most important thing. And if you say you're going to do something, you have to do it. And I think that's what saw me through on Titanic. Titanic was in some ways the roughest project that I've ever been involved with. And what saw me through on that was that I had a relationship with the people who were quite rightly panicking, but they never completely panicked because they knew who I was. And we always treated each other with a kind of a respect. And I always did what I think was the right or ethical thing throughout that. Even though it was costing me millions of dollars, personally, right out of my pocket. To do it, I felt I had to do it, or they would never trust me again on another film. And I think that's ultimately the most important currency that you reap from any situation. Pretty much every day. But the thing is that when you're in a leadership position, you can never, ever manifest that. You can never manifest the panic that you feel inside. And Titanic was a situation where I felt, I think, pretty much like the officer felt on the bridge of the ship. I could see the iceberg coming far away. But as hard as I turned that wheel, there was just too much mass, too much inertia, and there was nothing I could do. But I still had to play it through. There was no way to get off. And so then, you're in this kind of situation where you feel quite doomed, and yet you still have to play by your own ethical standards, no matter where it takes you, And ultimately, that was the salvation, because I think if I hadn't done that, they might have panicked, they might have pulled the plug, things might have been very different, the whole thing might have crashed and burned, but it didn't. We held on, we missed the iceberg by that much. Well, Titanic was conceived as a love story, and if I could have done it without one visual effect, I would have been more than happy to do that. The fact is that, the ship hasn't existed since 1912, at least not at the surface. So we had to create it somehow. I visualized making a lot of big sets and so on, and keeping the visual effects to a minimum. But it turned out that obviously it was a big visual effects show before we were all said and done. But that wasn't really my motivation to make the film, and I don't think that should ever be the motivation to make a film. That it should be a means to an end. Certainly there's an aspect of me that likes big challenges, big stuff, whether it's big physical construction or visual effects or whatever. I think that's what I do best, and I think there are other people that work at a much more intimate level and do that solely that are better at that, But I think that it was definitely a goal of Titanic to integrate a very personal, very emotional, and very intimate filmmaking style with spectacle, and try to make that not be kind of chocolate syrup on a cheeseburger, make it somehow work together. I think the spectacle got people's attention, got them to the theaters, and then the emotional, cathartic experience of watching the film is what made the film work. And I think also, the spectacle served it, but was not the defining factor in its success. Once again, I think it's a question of balance. It's sort of like looking at a painting and saying what part of the painting is the part that makes you like it. It's sort of all of it, and it's all of it working together that makes you like the painting. I didn't know for a long time. I was fascinated by the sciences. When I was a kid, I used to spend all my time out collecting pond water and looking at it through my microscope and trying to identify the various protozoa, or I'd be looking through a telescope trying to find the great nebula in Orion or whatever. My brain was going in all these different directions. Art was always sort of there. I was always drawing, but it hadn't really manifested itself as the main thing. And all the way through high school, even into college, I majored in physics. I hit a kind of a wall with the maths, and possibly with a bad teacher who kind of turned me off to calculus at a critical moment. And even though my grades were very high in astronomy and physics, I switched to English because I wanted to write. So it was sort of going in two different directions. It was a long time. It was about, I would say I was 25 or 26 before I really settled in and said, this is it, this is the decision, I'm going to work in film in some capacity. And what finally attracted me to film in such a definitive way was it was the only place I could reconcile the need to tell stories and to work in a visual art medium and the desire to understand things at a technological level, and my fascination with engineering and technology. It's one of the few media that are so dependent on technology. So it was a way to fuse those interests. I didn't know where I'd wind up within film. I actually started as a model builder and quickly progressed into production design, which made sense because I could draw, I could paint, and so on. But I kept watching that guy over there who was moving the actors around and setting up the shots, and I had never quite pictured myself as a director. I had pictured myself as a filmmaker, but I had never pictured myself as a director, if that makes any sense at all. I mean, I had wanted to make films, and I understood at some intellectual level that the director was the person who was most in charge creatively, but I'd never sort of pictured myself in that role, kind of standing up there, the guy with the monocle and the megaphone, had no meaning for me. But then I watched a couple of really bad directors work, and I saw how they completely botched it up and missed the visual opportunities of the scene when we had put things in front of them as opportunities, set pieces, props, and so on. And they had these great actors to work with, and they just blew it. And there was a moment where I said, I may not be very good at this, but I know I'm better than that guy. And that was kind of a critical moment, because when you realize that you can at least be better than somebody else who's already doing it, then you can visualize yourself doing the job. There were several light bulbs at several different times, and the first one was when I saw 2001: A Space Odyssey for the first time. And the light bulb there was, a movie can be more than just telling a story. It can be a piece of art. It can be something that has a profound impact on your imagination, on your appreciation of how music works with the images and so on. It sort of just blew the doors off the whole thing for me and at the age of 14, and I started thinking about film in a completely different way and got fascinated by it. It's also, to my knowledge, one of the first films that really had a definitive making of book. It was such a fascinating film that they made a book about the making of 2001. It's the first one that I knew of that was available, and I read it from cover to cover 18 times and didn't understand half of it until many years later. But it started a process of projecting myself into the idea of actually creating images using these high-tech means. Of course, I did all my low-tech analogs of those means, by buying models and gluing them on pieces of glass and moving them around. But it was good training to think spatially and to think, in terms of storyboarding and so on. So I was already a filmmaker, but I hadn't really realized it yet. And then ironically, that was happening in Canada, thousands of miles from Hollywood, and we subsequently moved at the age of 17 for me to Los Angeles, which is very close to, you know, the black hole of Hollywood itself. And yet at that point, I sort of said, well, I don't know if I can get there from here. I don't know if, you know, who am I to say that I could be a filmmaker? It didn't make any sense. So I abandoned it for grown-up things, and I decided to be a scientist. And it wasn't until, you know, many years later that I realized that this is really where my heart lay, you know. And then the next light bulb was really just the one that says, just do it. Just pick up a camera and start shooting something. Don't wait to be asked, because nobody's going to ask you. And don't wait for the perfect conditions, because they'll never be perfect. It's a little bit like having a child. If you wait until the right time to have a child, you'll die childless. And I think filmmaking is very much the same thing. You just have to take the plunge and just start shooting something. Even if it's bad, you can always hide it, but you will have learned something, you know. I didn't really have anything to say, but I had a lot of images, a lot of things crowding into my mind visually. I had read tons of science fiction. I was fascinated by other worlds, other environments. For me, it was fantasy. It was not fantasy in the sense of pure escapism. It was, as Isaac Asimov used to say, science fiction readers are people who escape from reality into worlds of pollution, nuclear war, overpopulation, and you know, it's a way of modeling the future or the present through the future. So, you know, growing up in the '60s, coming to my kind of intellectual awakening in high school at a time when the world was in complete chaos between the war in Vietnam and civil rights and all of the upheavals, all the social upheavals, you know, free love, you know, everything that was happening in the late '60s. It gave one an interesting perspective, being a science fiction fan and looking at a world that was coming apart and thinking in very apocalyptic terms about that world. And I've never lost that sort of almost a fascination with apocalyptic themes, and Titanic is just another manifestation of that, because for me, that film was just a microcosm for the way the world ends. However it ends, we don't know, but if it ends by the human hand, it'll end in the way that Titanic ended, which is through some casual, simple carelessness. So, you know, being a child of the '60s in that way, I think very much influenced the way I looked at what could be done with film. It was also a very interesting time in filmmaking, the history of filmmaking, because it was the time when the paradigm of studio film production was completely deconstructed, and the independent films emerged, and all of a sudden the filmmaking world was turned on its head, and a film called Easy Rider came out that was made for $40,000 and made more money than any other film of that year, including all of the big studio films. And so the big smokestack industry of Hollywood was suddenly threatened from within by these auteurs, these punks, these young, you know, George Lucases and Martin Scorseses. And, you know, so it was a fascinating time, and that's the time at which I came into my awareness of what film was and what film could be. So I was definitely informed by that. But I would say I didn't really have anything to say yet. You know, I just had a lot of images and ideas, but I hadn't you know, found my themes. It took time for that to happen. It took another few years. Never give up, because it's going to be unbelievably hard. It's going to be a ridiculously brutal uphill fight all the time. And you just have to have tremendous stamina and self-confidence to power through it. You have to not listen to the naysayers, because there will be many. And often they'll be much more qualified than you and cause you to sort of doubt yourself. But, you know, what I learned from those early days was to trust my instincts and to not back off, because when the hour gets dark your instinct is to, or your tendency might be to say, well, this is just too hard, and nobody should have to go through this in order to accomplish X, whether it's a movie or whatever. But in the pursuit of excellence, and I think you can be in the pursuit of excellence when you're working on a low-budget science fiction horror film, if it's how you define it, you have to go all the way. It's that simple. Now, I don't mean trample over people. I don't mean turn into a screaming maniac. I mean you have to have made that commitment within yourself to do whatever it takes to get the job done and to try to inspire other people to do it. Because obviously the first rule is you can't do it all yourself. Even though you may know how to do many of these different tasks, you physically can't do it. And you need a team, and you need the respect and the trust of that team. So that was a lesson that took me a while to figure out, because at first I just wanted to do it all myself. I was like, you're doing it wrong, you know. And that doesn't work. That doesn't ultimately achieve the vision, whatever the vision is, whether it's someone else's vision or when in my case when I started directing, it was my vision. I couldn't push people out of the way. I had to learn to inspire people to give me their best work. And I also had to learn to accept what they brought, even if it was either A, not as good, or B, good but just different from what I had imagined, and say that the end result of our collective efforts will be exactly that. It'll be all of our efforts together. It won't ever be exactly the way I imagined it. And that's, I think, an important lesson as well, is that in any group enterprise, it's going to be the sum total of the group. So choose your group well, and go in with that little voice in the back of your mind that says, be zen about it, be philosophical. It's ultimately going to be the best that these people can do. And that's an interesting thing, because it a little bit flies in the face of the auteur theory. And I was sort of raised aesthetically on that auteur theory, and looking at the much vaunted Hitchcock films that were planned down to every frame and every molecule through storyboarding, and it all flowed from the forehead of Zeus. It's not that way. You're a band leader. When you're doing your job best, you're a band leader. It's tough, and I'm still learning it. But I've learned it well enough, I think, to do some of my best work as a result of that lesson. By inspiring the actors on Titanic, and in fact everyone on that film, the production designers, the people that were, there were several thousand people working on that film, by somehow inspiring them to do their very, very best. They brought me, I think, all of the elements, all of the moments that eventually became that film. I couldn't have done it all myself. Couldn't have done a fraction of it, I had dark hours on Titanic that were just as dire, if not more dire, than on Piranha 2 when I got fired, on Terminator when we had all these problems. I think that there's just I think that you have to find some kind of inner strength that says what I'm doing is right. It may not seem right to other people, and I may not be able to please them right now, and I'm going to have to proceed on this path for a while until I can demonstrate to them that what we're doing is probably the right thing, at least the best that I know how to do. And ultimately, you reach a point where people will hire you because you have the strength, or some people call it vision. I don't know. That's a bit of a lofty word, because I don't think it's something that comes to you necessarily in the night. I think it's something that's the process of a very rigorous mental processing of the data on a day-by-day basis, and the possibilities, what you can do and what you can't do. And over time, people will realize that you have what it takes to be in that situation where nobody really knows the answer, although a lot of them think they do or say they do. And you've come up with the right formula. And to have come out of these battle situations a number of times with the right formula on a consistent basis, they tend to trust you more as you go along. They'll never trust you completely. Whoever the they is. In my business, it's the studio that's putting up the money, the completion bond company, whatever, the bankers. The people that don't really understand the day-to-day sweat, blood, and tears of the creative process. Because that's another lofty term, the creative process. When you're on a set, the creative process consists of, oh my God, how are we going to do that? You're going to have to move the wall back 3 feet, and then you're going to have to pile up some boxes over here and put the camera on it. It's all nuts and bolts things. And then you have to be able to switch that off in a heartbeat and think about what's the actor feeling? You know, what's the character feeling at that moment? And it might be some really important, very pivotal scene for them. So. I would say there's a certain tenacity that's required, and that tenacity manifests itself sometimes in unpleasant ways, and other times it can manifest itself in very noble ways when you can get other people to go with you that extra mile. And I think a lot about of what is misunderstood about my particular filmmaking process is that I get people to go that extra mile that they've never done before, and they go into new territory. They go beyond what they previously thought were their limits. And then afterwards they talk about it like it was a big adventure. Oh man, we worked around the clock, and we all almost died. And it sounds like an indictment of the production as a bunch of wackos, but when in fact they're actually they want to share the fact that they did this, that they did go beyond. They went beyond in their creative capacity as well. And that's why they always all come back and want to do it again. Maybe just not right away. But I don't make films back to back anyway, so that I usually give them a year to go out and see what it's like on all those other boring movies, and then they all want to come back. I lived in a small town. It was 2,000 people in Canada. Little river that went through it. We swam in a lot of water around. Niagara Falls was about 4 or 5 miles away, the Niagara Falls. And so, I've always sort of loved the water, possibly as a result of that. And that's manifested itself, obviously, in my work and in my own private time. I do an awful lot of scuba diving. I love to be on the ocean, under the ocean, live next to the ocean. But in terms of some wild family dynamics or anything like that, nothing that would necessarily indicate anything. I would say my mother was an artist. She was actually a housewife, but she was an amateur artist. My father was an electrical engineer. So right there, you have a collision of left and right hemisphere thinking, and I think I got sort of equal parts of both. My mother was definitely an influence in giving me a respect for art and the arts, and especially the visual arts. And I used to, go with her to museums and so on. And when I was learning to draw, I would sketch things in the museum, whether it was an Etruscan helmet or a mummy or whatever. I was fascinated by all that. I think out of an attempt maybe to get my father's respect or interest or whatever, I was, or maybe it was just a genetically passed through love of technology. I was always fascinated by engineering, always trying to build things, definitely a builder. And sometimes being a builder can put you in a leadership position when you're a kid, because then it's like, hey, let's build a go-kart. Well, you go get the wheels and you get this, and pretty soon you're at the center of a project. I think that certain things must just be genetic, because I look back at who I was at 10 years old or 9 years old, and I'm the same person now. In essence, wanting to build things and wanting to get a lot of people together and do some grandiose thing, whether it was build a fort or a tree house or an airplane. Once we built an airplane, not intending it to fly, just hang from a tree, but that sort of thing. And I realize I'm just doing the same thing now, just getting a bunch of kids to help me build a fort, except that now it takes $100 million, and the kids are all my age. Yes, good student, mostly because of curiosity. I mean, a real natural curiosity. I wasn't trying to please anybody. I wasn't trying to, for me, it wasn't competitive against the other kids. It wasn't about trying to please my parents so much as I just wanted to know things. The sciences, history, even math, to an extent. I was just, I was just switched on somehow. And I think, that's the most important thing when I look back to that formative period, and I'm thinking junior high through high school. That it was a 6-year period. It was curiosity, and I spent all my free time in the town library, and I read an awful lot of science fiction, and the sort of the line between reality and fantasy blurred. I was as interested in the reality of biology as I was in reading science fiction stories about, genetic mutations and post-nuclear war environments and distant, interstellar travel and meeting alien races and all that sort of thing. I read so voraciously. It was tonnage. I rode a school bus to school for an hour each way each day in high school. Because they put me in a program, an academic program that could only be serviced by this high school that was much further away. So I had 2 hours a day on the bus, and I tried to read a book a day. And usually it averaged a book every other day. But if I got really interested in something, it was propped up behind my math book or my science book, all during the day in class. So it was really more by authors. It would have been Arthur Clarke and A.E. Van Vogt, all the kind of the mainstream old guard of science fiction at that time. And then in the latter years of high school, then you get into the newer guys at that time, Harlan Ellison, Larry Niven, people like that. But it was pretty much a steady diet of science fiction. A critical moment for me, I would have to say, was in my we didn't call them sophomore, senior year sort of things there. It was in the 11th grade. My biology teacher, Mr. McKenzie, decided that what our school needed was a theater arts program, and we didn't have it. There was wrestling, basketball, football. It was a very jock-oriented school, and there was no theater program whatsoever. So we started a theater program from scratch. We bootstrapped it. He taught it, and I think he might have done it for nothing. And we took the class, but we really had to build the props and the scenery and the costumes and just do everything ourselves. And we had to turn the stage into a proper working stage. And it took a year, but we started putting on our own productions. And I think that was really a pivotal moment. And so my biology teacher was our muse at that time. And I think the fact that we were having to do everything, that it wasn't handed to us, may have created a kind of a work ethic that paid off then in independent film production, because it's the same thing. You're finding scraps and bits and pieces and putting it all together and putting on a show. And it's that sense of being able to create some moment of glory, some showmanship out of nothing, out of baling wire, that is maybe the lesson that was learned there as a result of this man who just decided to have a theater arts program. Otherwise, I would have been just, somebody who was marginalized by the fact that it was a very athletically oriented school. And now I've gone back to the school recently and found out that the theater program is the thing that the school is most proud of. Their teams are doing terribly, but their theater program is doing great, and they're winning in all these, dramatic awards around the province. This is back in Canada, so that's his legacy. But anyway, I think the point is that a teacher can be absolutely critical at the right moment in your life, and it can be a mentor. And sometimes it's only just one comment that they can make. And I remember I was talking to this man, my biology teacher, and he said, I've seen your aptitude tests or whatever kind of testing they did back then, 30 years ago in Canada, and we believe that you have unlimited potential. Now, I don't know if he'd ever seen the tests, and I don't know if any of the data indicated that, but hearing that and knowing that somebody somewhere believed that I could go accomplish something was a big contributor to the self-confidence necessary to overcome all these things later, because you're going to have 10,000 people telling you why you can't do something. Sometimes it only takes one person to tell you that you can do something, and you take it to heart. Otherwise, I wouldn't have remembered it all these years, you know, and I remember where the conversation took place. I certainly didn't think of myself as gifted. Certainly the standards for being gifted in my environment were if you were good in Little League or if you were good in football, or, you know, so I was more like the kind of the misfit, the outsider. And of course the misfits and the outsiders all collect together, like this kind of, you know, pond scum around the sides. And that's where all the, you know, I think the good ideas come from. I certainly never thought of myself as you know, superior or gifted in any way. Just different, definitely different. And satisfied to be different. Maybe not always happy to be different, but satisfied to be different. Your defense mechanism becomes to be, you know, contemptuous of people who don't think outside of the box. And you know, I spent maybe, you know, a 10-year period in there, you know, being in a way kind of intellectually snobbish and saying, you know, you guys are just a bunch of jock idiots. And then I've spent the last, you know, 25 years trying to reintegrate myself into a kind of normal, you know, being a normal person. And with, you know, limited success probably, but I would say that my father was completely unsupportive in any way, shape, or form, and was really sort of just sharpening his knives, waiting for me to fail so that he could say, aha, I was right, you should have gone into engineering. And it was always this sort of attitude of, well, you know, one of these days you'll get a real job and this film thing, you know, will pass as a fad. And so there was zero support there. And I actually think that it made me angry enough that I had to succeed. I think if I had a soft, rosy, supportive kind of, it's good if you do it, but if it doesn't work out sort of thing, it would have been different. But it kind of made me mad. And I had to prove that I was right, that this was the right thing to be doing. And I think it made me mad enough to get good, you know. My mother, of course, at an earlier time was very supportive of the art and you know, the visual aspect of it. So it was an interesting kind of dynamic there that probably actually served me in the long run, although it's hard to see it at the time. It was certainly difficult financially, but you know, you learn to survive. You learn to prioritize, and you learn, I think, also that if you're going to do something, you have to do it all the way, and you have to just put it before all other things. I think you know, the old adage, the harder I work, the luckier I get. I think chance is not a big factor in the long run. It can be a huge factor in the short run, being at the right place at the right time. But certainly the critical factor, even with that chance, is being able to recognize a true opportunity and seize it the moment it presents itself, and not wait and overthink it because it will pass, you know. And I think there are many talented people who haven't gotten to fulfill their dreams because they overthought it, or they were too cautious, and they were unwilling to make the leap of faith. I think there are a lot of people who are winos sleeping rolled up in a carpet remnant down in some alley someplace that also made that leap of faith and either made it at the wrong time or never had the skill to back it up. So it's necessary but not sufficient to have that as part of your makeup. But I think if you don't have the ability to make that leap of faith, it's going to be harder for you to accomplish something great, because there are going to be moments, there are going to be little windows of opportunity that open for a split second, and you either squirt through or you don't. But at the moment that you do that, you have to have prepared yourself. You have to have prepared yourself for that fight, because that's going to be the fight of your life. Whatever that opportunity is, when you grab it, it's going to be more energy than you can manage. It's going to be grabbing the tiger by the tail. And if you have not prepared yourself mentally for it, through study, through knowing and hypothesizing what it will be like when you're in that position, you won't be able to deal with it. And half of what you've concluded before the fact in your theoretical projections is going to be wrong. but half of it'll be right, and that's the part you're gonna prevail with. The films that influenced me were so disparate that there's almost no pattern. Stanley Kubrick was an influence because I loved 2001: A Space Odyssey, and the more I learned about him and his methodology, the more I realized what a rigorous. I don't even want to use the word perfectionist because that has a kind of a fussy connotation of unnecessary work, of unnecessary complication of the process. I think that his process was everything he did was necessary, but it was a rigorous intellectual exercise for him, and I was inspired by that. I've since come to learn that for myself it doesn't work that well, that there has to be some chaos, there has to be some looseness, so that the actors are given the opportunities that they need to give you their best. And that you have to not have preconceived it in such crystallinely perfect form that you don't leave the door open for the magic. Because the magic doesn't come from within the director's mind, it comes from within the hearts of the actors, I believe. And so you just have to be there to kind of seize it at the right moment. But that was definitely an influence, and an important influence. Then the films, it was all the films that I saw in my last 2 years of high school. Those are the films that and maybe my first year of college. Those are the films that still burn very vividly for me. And they were everything from Woodstock to Catch-22 to Easy Rider to The Graduate. You know, it was such an amazing time. I mean, up through, let's say, The Godfather. You know, it was just such an amazing time in film production. Bonnie and Clyde, just an amazing time, very eclectic and just breaking all the rules. Star Wars was very interesting because that was probably the film that galvanized me to get off my butt and go be a filmmaker. And the way it worked for me was that I was an artist, I was fascinated by space, I was always painting spaceships and living in this world of these whizzing, dynamic space battles and all that sort of thing. And I used to play, we used to play Battleship when we were in class, where we'd just send coordinates to each other by notes and try to blow. Well, we turned it into Space Battleship, and we'd draw these elaborate spaceships and try to blow each other up. That was my senior year in high school. So, I was living in a Star Wars world in my mind, and all of a sudden I saw this film, and it was like somebody had reached into my hindbrain and yanked out a lot of stuff that was in there, and I was seeing it on the screen, realized. And not to take anything away from George's creation, because it's obviously a phenomenal milestone, but my reaction to it was not, oh, wow, that's cool, I want to see more. It was, oh, wow, I better get off my butt because somebody's doing this stuff, and they're beating me to it. That was my reaction. So, I basically quit my job and started, doing a little film with visual effects, and sucked my friends into that vortex, and we all quit our jobs. And fortunately, we've all managed to successfully transition into filmmaking of that little group of 4 people. The thing that is exciting about filmmaking is to think back to the moment in time right before you had the idea, and think about that at the moment that you're sitting or standing on the set, and there are thousands of people around, and they've built this huge set, and there are all these actors, and there's all this energy and all this focus, and realize that it's all in the service of something that was made up out of whole cloth. That's fun. That's what an architect must feel like when they drive down the street and they look up and see a building that they designed. It's something that you imagined made tangible. And I get that rush much more on the set than I do when the film is done, because for some reason when the film is done, you've lived with it for so long that it's not new anymore, and it almost seems like just destiny. That's just what it is. But there's a time on the set when it's new, and you can walk into it and you can see it, and it's this physical, tangible manifestation of pure imagination. Now, as much fun as that is, it becomes a curse the next time you sit down and face the blank CRT and you have to come up with something, because you know that there's going to be a moment in time when everybody's going to be standing around having built this and having gathered to do it, and this huge human enterprise, and you better think of something good, you know. So it's sort of the rush that you get out of it, but it's also the thing that haunts you before you start. I think that characterizing whatever I've brought to filmmaking is probably best left to others. I know what I've tried to do, which is tell stories that excite the imagination and maybe say something at a thematic level, maybe something about the human condition with respect to our human relationship with technology, because ultimately I think all my stories have been about that to one degree or another. And to allow people to step through that screen into that world, whatever it is, you know, whether it's the world of the Abyss or the world of the Terminator or Titanic, to let people live in that, create that space for them, and let them live in the shoes of those characters for a while. That's what I set out to do. I think it's really up to others to sort of sort it out, what it ultimately means. The thing is that I see my things that I've done that I know were inspired by other things. I see then other filmmakers picking up on my leads, taking it further, and I realize that it's part of an ongoing creative process that is kind of self-perpetuating. And so I think of myself as part of as a link in a chain of cinematic ideas, and it's fun. It's fun to have that place. Ultimately, the frontiers of filmmaking have never changed. I mean, I think they change in the specifics of the technology and the technique. But ultimately, it's somebody sitting in a room writing, it's actors saying the lines in front of a lens, and that image being captured, and that little slice of life, those characters, those relationships, being made alive in the minds of other people all around the world. I don't think that is fundamentally going to change indefinitely. I think the specifics are going to probably change a lot. You know, we'll have electronic, digital presentation of the films, you know, projection of the films. That's going to then start to inform the entire post-production process, where ultimately we won't be working on film anymore. We'll call it film, but there won't be any film involved. It may be shot electronically. Film itself as a substance, as a thing, may be obsolete within 10 to 20 years, other than, you know, atavistic artists who choose to shoot on film because of some real or perceived artistic need, in the same way that people still make pots by hand, even though there are machines that make them beautifully. But I think that you know, from a visual effects standpoint, I think that visual effects it's happening now. It's not even the next frontier. Visual effects are just becoming integrated into the basic fabric of filmmaking, where they're not something other. They're not something that is outside of the normal filmmaking process. Now all directors are working with visual effects, and it's just become as basic to the technique as a light or a dolly or whatever, which is good, I think. This is good. It's good to think it's empowering, I think, to the imagination to let people create whatever it is they want to create, and do it in a very easy and straightforward manner, which visual effects are now capable of doing because of the ease of digital compositing. In terms of computer graphics and animation, I think that's going to continue to have an increasing role. And I think that you know, very real characters will come out of that. I don't think we're going to replace actors. They're going to have to be non-human characters. I think there has to be a reason to do a CG character, and the reason is it can't be you or I. It can't be somebody that you cast and stick in front of a camera. It's got to be something different. But the traditional techniques of putting rubber on people's faces and making rubber puppets and moving them with hydraulics and so on, I think are going to fall by the wayside. Actors will still be empowered within that process, because it'll ultimately still be a performance created by an actor in some way. They just won't have 5 pounds of makeup stuck on their face. There are many things that I'd love to do. There are still a lot of stories that I want to tell. I get very excited by all kinds of different stories. I'd love to do a film with a scientist as a main character, and really try to communicate to people the passion of science, because our culture thinks science is kind of unhip. You know, scientists get it, but I think that the greater community doesn't understand how scientists think, what drives them, and how their passion can be as great as the passion of an artist or the passion of a great athlete, which our culture respects much more, unfortunately. I'd love to be able to crack that nut, because I don't think it's been done well. I don't think Hollywood has served the science community well. They're usually stereotypes, you know, geeks, bad guys, or distant, unemotional people. And of course, none of that is true, or it can certainly be true of individuals, but it's not generally true. I used to think that the great films that I saw, the great works of art, were just something that somebody imagined in every detail and then went and did. I didn't realize that the creative process is the end result of a lot of different people bringing a lot of different things to the table, and it's impossible to predict, and it's a real-time monitoring, shaping, molding process that goes along, and the end result may be quite different than what you imagined when you started out. But that's how it works. That's what it is. In terms of achievement, you know, I'm at an interesting point right now, because just having done this film, it's definitely a high watermark, and I have to evaluate what that means. Do I let the success of that overpower my artistic instincts? You know, because there's a lot of things I want to do, and some of them I know for certain are going to be disappointments to people who think that you know, I'm going to come out and try to kick Titanic's butt, because it might be some little intimate thing, or it might be something that's a little off center. And I think that what I find, interestingly enough, is that sometimes success brings with it a tremendous amount of scrutiny and anticipation of what's going to happen next, and that's not a good thing necessarily. That you want to have the freedom to just react instinctively as an artist, and not second guess yourself. So, you know, when I've been speaking to young people, which I've been doing a lot lately, that are right at the cusp of sort of deciding their path, I relate to where I am right now. I relate where I am right now a little bit to where I was when I was 17, 18 years old, and thinking, oh, I've got to make this big decision. You know, I've got to make this big decision what I'm going to be, and if I mess it up, I mess up my whole life. You know, and it's just not like that. It's an evolving process. So I think the illumination that I might be able to share, that might mean something to people that are 17, 18, 19 years old, and right in that point where they just think they've got to make this big decision, is you've got time. As long as you follow your heart, you'll be going the right direction for you. It may not be the direction that everybody around you thinks you should be going, but it'll be what's ultimately right for you. And I think the problem for a lot of people, especially when they show great potential, is that all of a sudden you got 50 people in your hip pocket telling you what you should be and what you should do. And that sometimes people need a push. Other times that those voices can be deflecting you off your true course. And I didn't find my true course until I was 25, so you've got time. I don't think you have till you're 45, but I think you have at least until you're, you know, in your mid-20s. And of course there are stories are legion of people who don't find their true calling until they are in their 40s or 50s. I had the great opportunity to become briefly friends with a woman who died recently at the age of 105. She's an artist in California named Beatrice Wood, and she was a little bit the inspiration for the character in Titanic. In fact, I called her up and asked her permission to use her a little bit, to interview her and use her as a kind of a model for this character, even though Beatrice had no connection to Titanic itself. And she said, "Oh, I couldn't possibly do that because I'm only 35." She was 102 at the time. She was an artist who none of her significant work was done before she was 90. She kind of switched on when she hit 90. And I think that's an interesting thing to remember. What people call obsession or passion, for me, is just a work ethic. And I think it comes a little bit from an insecurity that I'm not good enough, that I have to, that there are other people out there that I admire, that I grew up admiring, that are still, that are still making movies, and those movies are great. And I've got to compete with these guys and these women, and have I thought of everything? Have I thought of every detail? Is this the best the scene can be? So that it comes a little bit from a healthy insecurity, the healthy insecurity that makes you better as an artist. And just from a kind of gonzo intensity, it's just, I just like to do it full bore. For me, it's not about being comfortable. I want to be in there. I want to help the guys move the dolly. I'm at my best when I'm neck deep in ice water, trying to work out how we're going to, keep the lights turned on when the water hits the bulbs. The more the challenge is, the more I enjoy it, and the more I can lead other people into these situations where they all think they're going to die, the more fun I'm having. So needless to say, we have a few washouts. We have a few people that don't like my version of day camp. But I would say that 80 or 90% of them feel like they've been through something. They've done the best that they've done in their professional careers, and they're usually pretty eager to re-up for another one. Well, as a Canadian, the American dream had a very negative and pejorative connotation when I was growing up, because it was this kind of cultural imperialism. I grew up in a border town on the other side of the border in Niagara Falls, Canada, and but since I moved to the United States at the age of 17, I actually feel very much like I'm probably, in my basic genetic nature, much more American than Canadian, because I really believe in a lot of I believe strongly in a lot of the traditional values of this country, in terms of respecting individuals' rights, the rights to the freedom of speech, and a lot of the things that are in the basic fabric of this country. And I think that Americans and Canadians, even to a large extent, they come from frontiersman stock. So they're people who hewed their civilization out of the wilderness. It wasn't given to them. It's not like people growing up in Italy or France in the shadow of past glories from thousands of years before. We made what we have, and we don't have a great cultural depth like they do, but what we have is ours by God. And I like that. I like that about it. It sort of puts your hand on the tiller of destiny in a way, and America definitely has its hand on the tiller of destiny for this planet. For good or bad doesn't mean you know what you're doing. Necessarily. But the other thing is that Americans are very, very happy to argue like crazy about everything, and just hold things up to ridicule and challenge that other countries just take for granted. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, the whole Monica Lewinsky thing is the dark side of that. It just goes on and on forever, and the other countries all think we're a bunch of idiots. But it's a manifestation of a good thing, that everything has to be examined and challenged. And that's a great thing. I mean, certainly, from an achievement standpoint, anybody can come here from anywhere, and if you've got the goods, it's a meritocracy. Yes, there are inequities, just like anywhere, but we challenge the inequities. We're trying to evolve. Other countries aren't. Many other countries, certain other countries, aren't even trying to evolve. They're not trying to challenge those inequities. So I think that there's something that can happen here that's unique, and certainly because America has embedded within it this thing called Hollywood, or the movies, or whatever, which is this kind of mecca to which filmmakers from all over the world come and participate. It's become a kind of entertainment / pop culture leader for the world, and so there's a grave responsibility in that as well. I'm not sure that that responsibility is necessarily being, that mantle is being worn well necessarily right now, but it's the place to be, I could go on for hours about that.